Welcome to the Stories for Sleep channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like right away, because by the end of the lecture, you'll be fast asleep. Close your eyes, the story is about to begin. In the late 8th century, a new force descended upon Europe. Scandinavian warriors appeared suddenly, landing on shores, penetrating deep into the continent's interior, and escaping, leaving behind only ruins. Their ships moved against the wind and sailed up rivers inaccessible to other fleets. The warriors didn't wait for long sieges or waste time on negotiations. They attacked swiftly, took everything valuable, and left, giving their enemies no chance for revenge. Such raids were a new phenomenon for Europe. Warfare had previously been conducted differently, armies gathered for weeks, battles decided the fate of states, and invaders occupied lands rather than merely looting them. The Vikings changed this order. They moved rapidly, struck the most vulnerable points, and instilled fear with their mere appearance. In a few decades, they accomplished what many peoples before them had failed to do. They destroyed the sense of security that had been built up over centuries in the kingdoms of Western Europe. The culture of the North. Scandinavia at that time lived by its own rules. People were accustomed to relying only on themselves. He who wanted power had to take it by force, and he who could not defend his property lost it. Rulers did not inherit crowns but gained influence through victories. A chief capable of leading his people to glory and wealth would gather loyal warriors around him and become the master of new lands. When this world changed, so did the people living in it. They began to seek opportunities beyond their native shores, venturing to distant countries, founding new settlements, and becoming kings in foreign lands. Their emergence was no accident. It was the result of centuries of struggle, the desire for a better life, and a thirst for discovery. Changing the map of Europe. The Viking voyages changed the map of Europe, shattering old boundaries and creating new political centers. In northern France, the Duchy of Normandy appeared, whose rulers would later conquer England. In Britain, they established their laws and eventually even claimed the English throne. In Eastern Europe, they became the ruling elite, controlling trade routes and serving in the armies of Byzantium. Even after the Viking Age ended, their influence did not disappear. They left behind cities, dynasties, laws, and a language that still echoes in English and French. Their descendants became rulers of kingdoms, and their martial traditions and seafaring skills formed the basis of the fleets that would determine the future of Europe. The word Viking in the early Middle Ages did not designate a people or a nation. In Old Norse, two terms existed. Vikinger was a person who went on a sea voyage, and Viking was the voyage itself, a raid, or an expedition. This term was not tied to origin, social status, or class. Vikings were those who gathered weapons, joined a warband, and set off for plunder, trade, or the search for new lands. A voyage could last a few weeks or stretch for years, but upon its completion, many returned to their usual lives, becoming farmers, artisans, or traders. Organizing a raid. Undertaking a voyage required significant resources. The chieftain or commander who organized the expedition had to gather people, prepare ships, and stock up on provisions and weapons. Sometimes he financed the venture himself, but more often he sought support among the nobility, who invested funds hoping for a share of the spoils. It was common for ordinary free peasants, eager to try their luck, to sell their property to buy gear and join the raid. After a successful raid, the spoils were divided according to established rules. The chief received the best portion: gold, jewelry, rare weapons, and cloth. The rest was distributed among the participants based on their contribution. Those who distinguished themselves in battle could expect greater rewards. Part of the loot went to communal needs, such as building ships, fortifying settlements, and religious offerings to the gods. If the captured property included slaves, they were either kept for labor on the homesteads or sold in markets, especially in Islamic countries and Byzantium, where there was high demand for captives. Diversity of the Northmen. Despite a shared culture, language, and traditions, there were significant differences among the Scandinavians themselves. During the Viking Age, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were not unified states. They were lands of many tribes, konungers, and jarls, each of whom ruled his territory and sought to expand his influence. This political fragmentation explains why the Vikings acted in different ways. Danes, conquest in the west. The Danes were the most numerous among those who went on raids. Their lands were closest to England and France, making them the main force that determined the fate of these regions. Their war bands crossed the strait and landed on the coast, looting monasteries and cities, and then began to settle in the conquered lands. Over time, their raids turned into a full-scale invasion that changed the balance of power in Britain. In the mid-9th century, the Great Heathen Army, consisting mainly of Danish Vikings, arrived on the islands. A significant part of England came under their control, a region known as the Danelaw. Later, Danish Vikings established themselves in northern France. The Frankish king Charles the Simple granted the Viking Rollo lands at the mouth of the River Seine, hoping to stop the attacks. This is how the Duchy of Normandy was born, whose rulers, a few generations later, would become key figures in European history. Norwegians, exploration and settlement. The Norwegians chose different directions. Their lands were distant from the densely populated European kingdoms, but the boundless sea lay open before them. They traveled west, discovering new islands and founding settlements where they met no resistance. In the late 9th century, they colonized Iceland, and a few decades later reached Greenland. Despite the harsh conditions, their settlements existed there for centuries, maintaining contact with Europe. They also moved along the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, creating trading centers and fortifications. Their ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean, reaching the coast of North America, where they settled in the land they called Vinland. These were the first Europeans to set foot on the soil of the New World, 5 centuries before the expedition of Christopher Columbus. Swedes, trade in the East. The Swedish Vikings moved east. Their focus was on trade rather than mass conquest. They used the waterways connecting the Baltic and Black Seas, controlling the flow of goods, silver, furs, and weapons. Their war bands founded fortified settlements that later grew into major cities. They did not seek to subjugate foreign peoples but established control over trade routes and formed alliances with local rulers. Their trace is visible in the history of Rus, where Varangian chieftains became part of the local elite, and their military detachments served in the Byzantine army. Each group sought its own path, but all were united by a thirst for new opportunities, a desire for wealth, and the search for glory. They chose their direction based on what the surrounding lands could offer, but their eyes were always fixed on the horizon. Perceptions from the outside world. The Vikings were a terrifying enigma for Europe. Their ships appeared on the horizon unexpectedly. The strike was lightning fast, and the consequences lasted for decades. They left behind nothing but devastated settlements, people carried off into slavery, and terror in the souls of those who survived. Contemporaries did not know who they were or where they came from, but they recorded tales of northern barbarians who feared neither kings, gods, nor death itself. Anglo-Saxons, God's wrath. England was the first to feel the full force of the Vikings, and for the Anglo-Saxons, they became the greatest threat. Monasteries spoke of them as punishment for sins, that the gods of the Northmen were stronger than Christ, and that the end of times was near. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, "In this year came the heathens, destroyed churches, killed priests, took all valuables, burned houses, and led people into slavery." But it wasn't just wealth that attracted them. The Vikings did not respect Christian priests. They couldn't understand how one could worship a god who forbade fighting, endured insults, and forgave enemies. Christianity seemed to them a religion of the weak. One chronicle says they laughed at monks who prayed for salvation instead of taking up swords. Frankish chroniclers regarded the Vikings with the same hatred but with greater pragmatism. They called them Northmen, Nortmani, noting that they were a formidable but calculating enemy. They wrote that the Vikings did not merely plunder but played a complex game, exploiting the disunity of European kingdoms and attacking where there was no defense. One Frankish chronicler bitterly remarked, "They come again and again because we ourselves give them the opportunity. We are weak, we are divided, and they know it." Byzantines, useful barbarians. The Byzantines viewed the Vikings differently. For them, they were barbarians, but useful ones. Trade with the northern lands passed through them. Vikings arrived in Constantinople not only with swords but also with goods. Byzantine chroniclers noted that they were skillful sailors, excellent warriors, but rough in daily life, heavy drinkers, and without measure in their rage. When the Varangians realized that it was more profitable to be friends with Byzantium than to fight it, they became mercenaries. Emperors hired them into the Varangian Guard, elite units that protected the palace. One chronicle states that they were incorruptible, did not betray their commanders, and fought to the last. Legends circulated about their strength, but also about their manners. One Byzantine writer wrote that after a battle, they would strip the skins from their slain enemies, and in their free time, they would hold drinking bouts capable of destroying an ordinary man. Arabs, traders, and the unclean. Arab merchants and travelers knew the Vikings differently. They called them the Rus and usually encountered them not as warriors but as traders. They came from the north, bringing furs, swords, and slaves. Arab chroniclers noted their strength, endurance, and tall, blonde figures. One author wrote, "They are like palm trees, they are tall. They have long hair braided into tresses. They clean their weapons every day and do not tolerate rust." But the Vikings also seemed wild to the Arabs. One of the most famous travelers, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, wrote, "They are the dirtiest of all Allah's creatures. They do not wash, they do not clean their clothes, and they do not tidy up after themselves." This observation, however, might only apply to the specific warriors he met during his expedition. Ibn Fadlan was also surprised by their cruelty and barbaric customs. He was particularly shocked by their funerary rituals. When a noble chieftain died, his body was not merely buried. Slaves and concubines were sent with him to the afterlife, sacrificed to accompany the master to the other world. Despite his revulsion, the Arabs respected the Northmen. They noted that the Rus never left the battlefield, did not retreat in fear, and that their war bands were bound more tightly than those of other peoples. A melting pot of warriors. Although the Vikings originated in Scandinavia, their detachments rarely consisted solely of Scandinavians. Their voyages attracted people of different origins. Those seeking wealth, glory, or a new life could join them regardless of their background. Slavs often fought against the Vikings, but sometimes went on raids with them, particularly in the eastern campaigns. Varangians actively interacted with East Slavic tribes and eventually became part of their elite. There is evidence of Slavs fighting side by side with Vikings in campaigns against Byzantium, and some served in the Varangian Guard. Celts were not only enemies to the Vikings. In Ireland and Scotland, Scandinavians not only fought with local clans but also formed alliances with them. Irish chronicles mention mixed armies consisting of Vikings and Irishmen. The Vikings married Celtic women, created families, and built settlements that eventually became part of the local culture. Balts were also involved. Important trading centers were located along the shores of the Baltic, where Scandinavians not only traded but also hired local warriors. Balts often became part of their crews, participating in distant voyages. Their influence is particularly noticeable in the eastern direction, where they actively interacted with the Varangian princes. The world of the Vikings was open to those ready to take up a sword and embark on a journey. Their war bands knew no national borders. They lived for plunder, glory, and adventure. The world in which the future Vikings lived was harsh, and this shaped their character long before the start of the Age of Voyages. Scandinavia in the 8th century was a land of long winters, short summers, and meager resources. The soil yielded little harvest, livestock struggled to survive the winter, and villages survived through sheer tenacity and mutual support. To survive, people learned to be decisive, resilient, and attentive to opportunities. If the land couldn't provide, they had to turn to the sea. Resource scarcity and internal conflict. One of the main reasons that drove the Scandinavians to launch voyages was the shortage of land. The population was growing, but there was little land suitable for life and farming. Land was most often inherited by the eldest son, forcing the younger sons to find their own path. Some remained to work for others, but many chose a different way, becoming warriors, traders, and travelers. The voyages offered a chance to gain rewards, achieve status, and sometimes establish their own homesteads in new lands. Internal conflicts exacerbated the situation. Scandinavia at that time was a mosaic of small conundrous kingdoms, villages, and clanlands. Centralized power did not exist. Alliances were temporary, and disputes between rulers were often resolved by war. The defeated often left with their people for other lands, not always willingly, but almost always with weapons. Those who could not find a place at home sought one overseas. Climatic and social pressures. Against the backdrop of political instability and resource scarcity, climatic difficulties intensified. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the climate became colder and less predictable. Harvests decreased, and famine years became more frequent. People lacking grain reserves began to seek other ways to survive. One such way became the voyage. The sword and the sail opened access to what the native land could not provide. The voyage had not only military but also social significance. Generosity in a chieftain was highly valued in Scandinavian society. He who could bring home loot and share it with his warband strengthened the loyalty of his men. Voyages became a way to accumulate wealth, a tool for consolidating power, and a means of political influence. Outfitting a ship, raising a troop, and returning with spoils, all this meant not only personal fortune but also an increase in political weight. For many young men, participating in a raid was a test and a chance to prove themselves. Glory and a name were valued no less than silver. A warrior who showed bravery earned respect, and sometimes the hand of a noble maiden. Even death in battle was seen as a path to eternal glory. From raids to trade and state building. When the Vikings first began appearing on European shores, they were spoken of as bandits and murderers. Their reputation was built on the initial raids, burned monasteries, and inhabitants carried off into slavery. Even at the very beginning of their expeditions, it is clear that targets were chosen deliberately. Strikes were aimed at wealthy and poorly defended places where the plunder was maximal and the risk minimal. As their experience grew, the warbands began to assess the situation more broadly. Instead of burning cities to the ground, the Vikings gradually began to use captured territories as a resource. This concerned not only land and people but also infrastructure. Where everything was once destroyed, markets, warehouses, and workshops began to appear. Jorvik, York, in Britain was transformed into a major centre of craftsmanship and trade. From a temporary camp, it became a stable point of exchange, where merchants and artisans came, where bargaining took place, and where tolls were collected. Similar hubs appeared in Ireland and Scotland. In the east, trade developed along rivers, the Dnieper, Volga, and Neman. Through them, Scandinavians reached Byzantium and the Islamic world, establishing exchange with Arab and Persian merchants. These routes became a vital part of the Scandinavian economy. The connecting link of this system was the ships. The Scandinavian longships, drakers, fast, light, and with minimal draft, gave the Vikings a tactical advantage that Europe could not counter. They freely passed up rivers, could land at any point on the coast, and depart just as quickly. Walls, garrisons, and even natural barriers were ineffective against them. The warriors appeared where no attack was expected and vanished before the enemy could react. But the same ships that carried warriors also carried goods. Artisans, merchants, and envoys traveled on these same vessels. Knowledge and political ties sailed with them. The ship was a means of conquest, exchange, and horizon expansion. They provided the Vikings with speed, maneuverability, and independence. As the desire to settle intensified, forms of local governance emerged. The Vikings began to collect tribute, Danegeld, establish rules of trade, negotiate with local elites, and control settlements and exchange points. Their rule included securing roads, collecting taxes, managing land, and organizing fairs. Local communities were integrated into this system. Part of the tribute went to the new ruler, part remained in the economy, enhancing stability. Settlements grew up where temporary camps had been. Governing the captured territories became more profitable than destroying them. People capable of keeping accounts, striking deals, arranging defense, and ensuring the flow of goods were valued no less than those who wielded a sword. As the Viking economy expanded and their voyages became meticulously planned operations rather than impulsive forays, a new approach to target selection emerged. The first strike, Lindisfarne. To understand how they established themselves in Europe, one must return to the moment when their name first echoed in the chronicles. On June 8, 793, the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeastern coast of England was attacked. Ships built with technology unfamiliar to the locals approached the island. Armed men came ashore. They moved quickly, without entering into negotiations or explaining their goals. Within a few hours, the monastery was completely looted. The people inside offered no resistance. Those who could not hide perished or were captured. The captured monks were used as slaves or sold in markets. Some of them may have been kept alive if they were educated and could bring practical use, for example, if they could heal, keep records, or speak several languages. Lindisfarne Abbey held an important position. It performed religious, educational, and administrative functions. It housed relics, copied books, and accumulated wealth donated by local nobility. Crucially, the monastery had no fortifications. It was located on an island and was considered a place that did not require protection. The Scandinavians chose it not by chance. The raid was aimed at a territory where maximum profit could be obtained with minimal cost. The monastery was in direct reach of the sea, lacked a garrison, and represented a concentration of valuables. This corresponded to the logic of the early raids, pinpoint strikes on vulnerable but wealthy locations. The devastation of Lindisfarne caused a widespread reaction. Chronicles recorded the event as a catastrophe. Descriptions of foreigners who came from the sea and attacked a Christian holy site appeared in the texts of the time. This attack became a symbol of the beginning of a new era. Subsequently, such actions became systematic. After Lindisfarne, similar raids began in the territories of other kingdoms. Monasteries in Jarrow, Ireland, and along the coasts of Wales and Scotland suffered. The Scandinavians gradually expanded the geography of their campaigns. They noted convenient landing spots, explored the coastline, and assessed the defensive readiness of local communities. Repeated strikes on the same territories became common practice. The political situation in Britain favored the raids. The island had several independent kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia. They lacked unified command and did not coordinate their actions. This fragmentation was historical. After the Romans left in the 5th century, Britain was divided among various Anglo-Saxon tribes. Each region developed independently, forming its own structures of power and defense. There was no central authority, and attempts at unification regularly ended in internal conflict. These internal conflicts and power struggles weakened their ability to repel external threats. Coastal defense was not a priority. The Vikings actively exploited this. Their detachments carried out fast raids, didn't linger in one spot, and relied on speed and surprise. They avoided protracted battles but still achieved their goals. When one area began to fortify, the next blow would be delivered to a different region. The situation was similar on the continent. Following the dissolution of Charlemagne's empire, power was distributed among several rulers. Centralized defense weakened. Cities located inland were not considered vulnerable. However, the Scandinavians used rivers as transport arteries. They sailed up the Seine, Loire, and Garonne, attacking commercial and administrative centers. Viking ships allowed them to maneuver quickly, bypass fortifications, and appear where an attack was not expected. Local armies could not react in time. The first decades of Viking expansion were characterized by flexibility, precision, and a pragmatic approach. The Scandinavians did not aim for full-scale conquest. They studied the situation, identified weaknesses, and used every chance. Europe was vulnerable at that moment. This determined the success of the early campaigns and allowed the Vikings to gain a foothold. The Great Heathen Army and the Danelaw. In 865, a new phase of Scandinavian expansion began in Britain. By this time, the Vikings had been regularly raiding monasteries and settlements along the coasts for 70 years, but now the model itself changed. Instead of quick plunder, a large-scale campaign aimed at conquering and holding territories began. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other sources, the so-called Great Heathen Army arrived in England that year. Modern researchers believe this was the most organized and numerous Viking military force during their presence in Britain. Estimates suggest its size may have reached several thousand people. This wasn't just a band of raiders, but a mobile army with field logistics, leadership, and strategy. The leaders of this army are named in the sources as the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Their names appear in Scandinavian sagas and chronicles, though their historical authenticity is still debated. Legend has it that they invaded England to avenge the death of their father, who was supposedly killed by King Aella of Northumbria. The question of Ragnar's existence remains open. His figure is known primarily from Icelandic sagas, where he is described as a glorious warrior and ruler who campaigned in France and Britain. However, these texts were recorded centuries after the supposed events. Historians tend to consider Ragnar a composite figure based on several real Scandinavian chiefs of the era. If such a person truly existed, he was already dead by the time the Great Army arrived, and his son's entry into England occurred after his death, whether legendary or real. Conquest of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. England remained politically fragmented at this time. After decades of infighting, their resources were severely depleted. Alliances between kingdoms were temporary, changes of power were frequent, and a unified defensive system was absent. This allowed the Vikings to advance through the country in stages, facing only local resistance. The first major successes of the Great Army came in Northumbria. They captured its capital, the city of York, in 866. Control of the city was strategically vital, allowing them to manage northern trade routes and establish a presence in the region. Soon after, the kings of Northumbria, Aella and Osbert, attempted to retake York, but their army was defeated, and both kings died in battle. Next, the Vikings advanced into East Anglia. The local King Edmund was captured and, according to tradition, executed for refusing to renounce Christianity. His death was symbolic. He was later recognized as a martyr and canonized, becoming one of the national saints. After East Anglia, the army focused on the territory of Mercia. There was practically no organized resistance here. Some cities capitulated without a fight. King Bergred of Mercia chose to leave the country, going into exile. The region fell under Viking control. The only kingdom that did not submit during this campaign was Wessex. Its ruler, Alfred the Great, refused to pay ransom and began to build defenses, but this happened later. By the mid-860s, almost all of eastern and central England was under Viking rule. These territories became the foundation of the Danelaw, a zone where Scandinavian law was applied, settlements were built, and trade developed. The Great Army did not come just for loot. It came with the intention of a long-term presence and reorganization of the captured lands. By the end of the century, the Vikings were no longer a sudden threat. Their campaigns became a regular part of European politics. They were not just plundering but conducting true campaigns. The Frankish lands, previously thought to be out of reach, became a target accessible from the water. Among all the expeditions, the Siege of Paris in 885 became the largest Viking operation against the West Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne's empire had already dissolved by this point. Its borders were formally maintained, but real power had passed into the hands of local rulers. The central army was weak, royal authority had lost its prestige, and every major city was essentially defended independently. Paris was not yet the capital, but it already played a key role as a trade hub and a strategic point on the Seine. It became a symbolic target. In the autumn of that year, a vast Viking army approached the city. Frankish chronicles report 500 or 700 ships, which, even allowing for possible exaggeration, indicates a significant force. The total number of warriors varied from 3,000 to 10,000. While hard to confirm precisely, even the minimum estimate made this the largest campaign in the history of conflicts with the Franks. The army was commanded by a chieftain named Siegfried. He offered the city a chance to surrender and pay a ransom, following the old practice where many cities preferred to buy off destruction. But this time, Paris refused. The defense was led by Count Odo Uds, a young feudal lord who lacked direct support from the king. He fortified the city and concentrated the defense on the Al Dala site, a natural stronghold in the middle of the Seine connected to the banks by two wooden bridges. This decision allowed the defense to hold despite the enemy's numerical superiority. The initial Viking attacks were swift and aggressive. They set fire to the bridges and tried to break through by land and water, but all attempts were repulsed. The city stood firm and the siege began. It lasted for almost an entire year. The Vikings blocked the food supply, devastated the surrounding area, burned villages, and set up ambushes on the roads. Paris was completely surrounded. Sickness began in the city, and provisions ran low, but the garrison did not surrender. Odo himself participated in sallies, maintained order, and controlled supplies as much as possible. During the siege, Odo twice broke through the encirclement to appeal to King Charles the Fat. The king was in no hurry, his position was shaky, and he preferred not to risk his army. Only in mid-886 did he approach the city, and instead of a battle, negotiations began. The Vikings demanded permission to sail up the Seine to the Loire. Charles agreed. They were paid about 700 pounds of silver, a colossal sum for the era. For comparison, such a payment could hire an entire army for several months or ransom dozens of noble captives. It was more than the annual income of many large counties. Frankish chroniclers viewed this as a humiliation, but formally Paris was not taken, and the king avoided an open conflict. The siege ended, and the Vikings left. Consequences of the siege. The consequences were significant. Count Odo gained recognition. His tenacity in the city's defense gave him political legitimacy. Soon after, he was elected king of the West Frankish kingdom, the first time not by right of blood, but for proven ability in actual defense. The siege itself became a turning point. The Vikings showed they were capable of conducting large-scale operations, not just raids. Their interest was no longer limited to quick profit. They were ready to blockade cities, destroy infrastructure, negotiate, and dictate terms. Paris's resistance was also a signal. The era of unanswered raids was ending, and European cities were beginning to learn how to defend themselves. Nevertheless, that year was a reminder that even without a successful storm, the Vikings could achieve their goals. They obtained silver, influence, and the right to move on. Europe was not yet ready for constant defense, but Paris endured and thereby set an example that others would begin to emulate decades later. By the early 10th century, Viking attacks on Frankish lands were giving way to attempts to establish a permanent presence in regions where resistance was weak and conditions were favorable. The central authority of the kingdom lacked the resources for full-scale defense. In these circumstances, an idea arose: if the onslaught could not be contained by force, it could be turned into a treaty. In 911, King Charles the Simple offered a compromise to the Scandinavian chieftain named Rollo. Rollo was one of the most influential northern leaders, well known to both the locals and the court itself. Rollo commanded detachments that were not just raiding but establishing winter quarters and holding strategic points. The force behind him was real and entrenched. The agreement was concluded at St. Clair-sur-Epte. Under its terms, Rollo received lands in the lower Seine Valley, centered in Rouen. These territories passed under his rule in exchange for several obligations. He recognized the authority of the French king, accepted Christianity, and committed to defending the region from further invasions, including from other Vikings. This agreement solved several problems at once. The Franks effectively delegated the defense of an important region to the very people who had previously posed the threat. In return, the Vikings received not only land but also legitimate status. Rollo became a duke and could officially pass the title down to his heirs. His position was equal to that of major feudal lords, but he retained military and administrative autonomy. The acceptance of Christianity was a symbolic act. Sources report that Rollo was baptized and took the name Robert. His close associates were also baptized with him. This treaty marked the founding of the Duchy of Normandy and the official integration of the Viking elite into the European feudal system. This was a condition not only for political legitimization but also for entry into the circle of the European aristocracy. Christianity opened the way for marriages with local families, inclusion in existing legal structures, and participation in interfeudal alliances. Thus, Normandy was founded, a land handed over to the Northmen and named after them. Within a single generation, these territories became a full-fledged part of France's political map. Rollo's descendants adapted quickly. They adopted the French language, took on feudal institutions, but retained the military organization and governance traditions formed in the north. Normandy became an example of how former invaders could not only settle but also become a new elite. They didn't dissolve into the local culture, they reshaped it for themselves. The Vikings ceased to be an external threat. They transformed into a ruling class. Eastward expansion, trade, and the formation of Rus. By the mid-10th century, Scandinavians increasingly began moving eastward. Here, their interest was not military plunder, but trade. The rivers of Eastern Europe offered the richest land and river routes, connecting the Baltic Sea with the southern lands, first Slavic, then Khazar, and further to the borders of Byzantium and the Arab East. These routes provided access to silver, which had effectively become the currency of the entire northern world. The river systems of the Fokov, Lovat, Dnieper, and Volga became a kind of transport network. Scandinavians built light ships that could be dragged between rivers, bypassing watersheds, portages. In the north, they entered Lake Ladoga and Novgorod, from there moving south through the ancient lands of the Slavs, Finno-Ugrians, and Balts. Permanent camps, fortified points, and trading posts sprang up along this route. Some of them eventually grew into cities. The Varangians and the Rus. Contact between the Scandinavians and East Slavic tribes did not begin with war. The Varangians acted as an organized military and commercial force. They collected tribute, provided protection for caravans, and established control over sections of the route where stability was needed. This was a shift from spontaneous raids to a political role, especially in the northern areas of the future Rus. In the Slavic tradition, the Scandinavians were named Varangians, Variagi. This word came to denote not only people from the north but also the entire layer of foreign elite who managed trade centers and military structures. At the same time, the term Rus appears in Western and Eastern sources. It is highly likely that this word is also of Scandinavian origin and initially meant a warband united by a commercial military enterprise. Later, this very word would become the name of a new state. The main written source outlining the version of the Varangian arrival is the primary chronicle, Povest Vremenik Let, compiled in Kiev at the beginning of the 12th century. It tells how the Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes, tired of internal conflicts, summoned a Varangian prince named Rurik to establish order. He came with his war band, settled at Ladoga, and then at Novgorod. After his death, power passed to Oleg, who, in turn, seized Kiev and made it the center of a new state. The text of the chronicle carries elements of mythologization. Rurik's name is not known from other contemporary sources, and his existence is not archaeologically confirmed, leading researchers to disagree on whether he can be considered a real historical figure. Some see him as a composite image of the early dynasty. However, later figures, Oleg and Igor, are mentioned in treaties with other states, including Byzantine sources, which gives them a solid historical foundation. According to the chronicle, Oleg acted as an active conqueror and diplomat. He subjugated Kiev, united the northern and southern East Slavic lands, and controlled key parts of the trade route. His successor, Igor, continued to consolidate power. Archaeological data confirms the existence of major centers in Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev as early as the 9th and 10th centuries, with characteristic signs of Scandinavian presence, from elements of weapons and jewelry to burial rites. Thus, the Varangians in Eastern Europe acted not as invaders, but as integrators. They fit into the local power structure, adapted to the Slavic environment, but maintained their own practices in military organization and trade. The alliance between local tribal structures and the Scandinavian military elite gradually began to form Rus. By the end of the 10th century, the Vikings had mastered the river routes of Eastern Europe. Trade with southern countries strengthened, routes stabilized, and at some point, the Scandinavians became not merely intermediaries but active participants in the international exchange system. This led to closer ties with two powerful centers, the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic East. Through the system of rivers and portages, they reached the Black Sea and from there the shores of the Bosphorus. Constantinople, the largest city of the eastern Mediterranean, made a huge impression on the Scandinavians. In chronicles, it was called Miklagar, the Great City. It was here that they first encountered a developed urban civilization, Christian imperial rituals, and a new type of army. The Varangian Guard. Initially, the Byzantines viewed the Vikings with suspicion as a potential threat from the north, but it quickly became clear that this force could be utilized. The Scandinavians were warlike, organized, and disciplined. They fought in detachments that answered only to their chief. Their fighting style was suitable for complex tactical tasks, especially where reliability, not mere numbers, was important. In the late 10th century, Emperor Basil II decided to officially incorporate the Varangians into the imperial army. This led to the creation of the Varangian Guard, an elite military unit composed mainly of Scandinavians. They served as the emperor's personal bodyguard, participated in campaigns, and guarded the palace and treasury. Their loyalty was ensured simply: they were foreigners not involved in internal court intrigues. Service in Constantinople became a symbol of prestige for the Scandinavians. It provided not only wealth but also status. After several years of service, warriors returned home with spoils, money, and experience. Many of them brought back Byzantine weapons, textiles, and silver, along with elements of southern culture, architectural motifs, and even individual words. Scandinavian sagas preserved mentions of Miklagar as the richest city in the world, served by the best warriors of the north. Contact with the Islamic world. In addition to the Byzantine direction, the Scandinavians actively developed trade with Islamic countries. The main route ran along the Volga River, through Bulgar, the lands of Khazaria, and further south to the Caspian Sea. From there, merchant caravans could reach Caspian ports, and in some cases, even Baghdad. They are described as strong, freedom-loving, yet pragmatic merchants. It was the Islamic world that supplied Scandinavia with silver. Countless dirhams found in hoards across Scandinavia proved the scale of the trade. Relations were built on mutual benefit. Scandinavians brought furs, slaves, honey, wax, and weapons, and received textiles, metals, glass, jewelry, and, most importantly, money. While not everyone reached Baghdad, such cases are documented. Most likely, Vikings did not go there alone but joined merchant caravans. Their presence in the south is fixed through a chain of contacts from Bulgar and Khazaria to the territory of Persia and Mesopotamia. Crucially, here the Vikings did not act as invaders. They operated through diplomatic and economic ties, using existing routes and political structures. The Islamic world was not an arena for military operations for them, but it was vital as a source of silver and luxury goods. Thus, in the eastern and southern directions, the Vikings demonstrated not only their military strength but also their capacity for adaptation. They integrated into foreign systems, maintained their own identity, and at the same time maximized their benefit. These contacts left a deep mark on the culture, economy, and politics of both Scandinavia and the countries with which they interacted. Viking warfare, tactics and equipment. Military force was the basis of Scandinavian expansion, but the Vikings did not seek to build empires. They didn't leave behind castles, monuments, or developed administrative systems. Their goals were different: mobile, targeted, and focused on results. This distinguished them from most contemporary European armies. A Scandinavian war band, Druzina, could assemble quickly. It didn't need months to form, like a feudal levy. Every participant knew their place and acted within a familiar collective. This flexibility allowed the Vikings to act unexpectedly, strike where no defense was anticipated, and disappear just as quickly. They avoided open confrontation if they could do without it. Their main tactic was suddenness and speed. Rivers and sea routes played a special role. It was through them that the Vikings penetrated deep into Europe. Their ships were designed to move easily both at sea and up rivers, and even to be dragged over portages when necessary. This made landings possible in the most unexpected locations. They could approach a city not from the gates, but directly at the pier or via a narrow river arm. Scandinavian weaponry was chosen for availability and reliability. The most important element was the round wooden shield. It not only provided protection but was also used as an active combat tool for pressure, maneuvering, and breaking the enemy's formation. Its size allowed it to cover most of the body, and its lightness made it manageable even in a long fight. The most common weapons were spears and battle axes. The spear allowed them to maintain distance and operate in formation. The axe was especially effective in close combat against shields and light armor. Its shape provided a powerful blow and the ability to operate in confined spaces. The sword was not a mass weapon but a status symbol. It was expensive, often passed down through generations, and considered a sign of a free man. Scandinavian swords had a straight blade, were well balanced, and were designed for fast slashing blows. Many of them were made on the continent and acquired through trade or as trophies. Some blades found by archaeologists are decorated with inlays and master's marks. Armor was not universal. Most fighters wore thick clothing made of wool and leather, sometimes with metal inserts. Mail shirts, burnies, were worn by warriors of high standing, as were iron helmets with a nasal guard. The common image of a helmet with horns is nothing more than a later myth. In practice, such decorations would have been not only useless but dangerous in battle. Battle formation and the berserkers. In battle, the war band operated cohesively. They formed a tight row, shield to shield, the shield wall, pushing the front line forward as a single barrier. Defenders in the center held the line, and fighters on the flanks covered each other. Coordination was crucial. Vikings did not go into battle alone, every participant knew where they should be and how to interact with the others. In popular imagination, the image of a Viking is often reduced to the figure of an possessed warrior who loses control in battle, falls into a rage, and charges the enemy with superhuman strength. This image was formed under the influence of tales about berserkers and Lfnar, wolf hides, special types of fighters attributed with an altered state in battle. What was behind these images? Berserkers are first mentioned in Icelandic sagas and skaldic poetry. Their name translates as bear shirt, meaning fighting without armor, in bear skins. These were warriors who fell into a battle frenzy, berserkergang, losing fear and pain and feeling no blows. They were attributed with superhuman strength, insensitivity, and madness. Mentioned alongside them in the sources are the Lfnar, wolf hides, warriors who wore wolf skins and were associated with single combat, stealth, and maneuverability. If the berserker is the embodiment of rage, the Lfnar is the image of a predator acting in the shadows. It's important to understand that all written mentions of such warriors belong to a relatively late period, mainly the 13th century, when the sagas were already being recorded in Christian Iceland. Therefore, historians approach a literal reading of these texts with caution. Berserkers could have been real fighters distinguished by special training, fanatical devotion, or a psychological state, but not necessarily falling into a trance. There are theories that the combat state might have been achieved through special training or even psychoactive substances, such as mushrooms or stimulating decoctions. However, no source directly indicates the use of hallucinogens. It is more likely that this refers to a social or religious ritual that combines ceremony, collective pressure, and internal psychological preparation for battle. There is no archaeological confirmation of the existence of berserkers as a separate military institution. However, graves of wealthy warriors with amulets in the shape of bear claws or wolf teeth are found and may have belonged to those whom folk memory later considered carriers of animalistic rage. Over time, the berserker image became increasingly symbolic. In the Christian period, they began to be perceived as dangerous, antisocial, and even demonic. Some laws in Norway and Iceland mention a ban on behavior associated with berserk-like states, which suggests that such a practice, albeit in a modified form, did exist. The Jomsvikings, myth and elite warriors. The Jomsvikings are another element of Scandinavian tradition surrounded by an aura of mystery. In the sagas, they are described as a brotherhood of elite warriors who lived by a strict code, knew no fear, never retreated from battle, and obeyed only their leader. Their center was in the fortress of Jomsborg, somewhere on the southern coast of the Baltic, possibly in the area of modern Volyn in Poland. They appear in sources in the context of 10th century events. The Jomsvikinga saga recounts that they were disciplined, almost fanatic fighters who had no families, did not drink during campaigns, and were obliged to hold the line until the end, even if the commander ordered a retreat. They were admitted to the brotherhood only after a harsh ordeal. However, the authenticity of the Jomsvikings' existence is a matter of debate. There is no archaeological evidence of the Jomsborg fortress. Historians suggest that the legend may have been based on a real military base on the southern shore of the Baltic, possibly controlled by the Danes or local allies. The Jomsvikings may have been a select retinue, druzina, established by one of the Konungar, and their image later became endowed with the features of a knightly order. Nonetheless, the Jomsviking image became part of the culture. In Scandinavian sagas, they play a special role as the idealized warrior, subject to honor and duty, yet sometimes tragically dying due to too strict adherence to the rules. This was not just a fighter but a symbol of discipline and absolute loyalty. Most likely, the Jomsviking image was based on specific elite retinues or mercenary units operating in strategic points of the Baltic region, but their legendary character formed later in the literary tradition and folk memory. Vikings are often spoken of as warriors and sailors. But outside the battles, there was an entirely different world, daily life with its own rules, concerns, and stable traditions. Let's briefly leave the battlefield and look at how the Vikings lived, what they valued, and the role women played in their society. Settlements and social order. Viking settlements consisted of wooden houses roofed with sod or thatch. Inside was a communal hall where food was prepared, feasts were held, and affairs were discussed. Walls were insulated with hides, and the floor was strewn with straw. Windows were rare, and smoke from the hearth rose directly to a hole in the ceiling. The social foundation was the free farmer or bondi. These were independent householders who owned land, livestock, and weapons. They elected their jarls and participated in things, ting public assemblies where disputes were settled, judgments were passed, and alliances were concluded. Laws existed in oral form and were memorized by special people, or lgskummer, law speakers. Public reputation was valued more than property. The Vikings were skilled not only in warfare but also in construction, farming, and craftsmanship. Archaeological finds include artifacts made of bone, wood, bronze, and glass, combs, knives, needles, and various ornaments. Life was laborious and busy, with a clear division of roles and mutual dependence within the community. Diet and feasting. Diet depended on the season, natural conditions, and wealth. The basis of the diet was simple but hearty food. Thick porridges and flatbreads were made from grains. Meat was obtained through hunting, farming, or fishing. Roasted or boiled lamb, smoked pork, and stewed fowl were common meals. Fish was eaten regularly, especially in coastal regions. Dairy products like cheese and curds were made from milk. Root vegetables and cabbage were grown in gardens and supplemented main dishes, especially in winter. Festive feasts involved preparing large amounts of food and serving alcoholic beverages. The most popular were weak ale and mead, MJR, particularly in central and northern Scandinavia. Wine was extremely rare, imported by merchants, and remained a luxury. Communal eating was seen not only as a necessity but also as an important element of social order, where everyone knew their place and could be heard. The role of women. The role of women in Scandinavian society was more significant than in many other contemporary cultures. Although they did not participate directly in politics, they had rights to land, inheritance, and management of the household. In case of a husband's death, a woman became the full head of the house. Servants, workers, and sometimes even mercenary warriors were under her authority. Her word in household matters carried weight. Marriage contracts were concluded with women, and divorce was possible at the initiative of either the man or the woman. The maintenance of honor was crucial. Public humiliation, adultery, or cruelty could lead to divorce or a lawsuit. The image of the shield maiden is a separate question. Descriptions of women fighting alongside men, such as the shield maiden Brynhildr and Lagertha, appear in the saga tradition. Most historians consider this a literary element, not a reflection of mass reality. Archaeological finds, such as the burial of a woman with weapons in burqa, show that individual exceptions existed, but this was not the everyday norm. Women more often showed their strength through rituals, upbringing, and legacy management. Many were mistresses of the house, healers, and prophetesses, Volar. In Scandinavian epic, it is often the woman who foretells fate, performs the ritual, and preserves the lineage. Her power lay not in weapons but in knowledge and the right to manage the home. Viking hygiene. The image of Vikings in popular culture is often reduced to rough and unkempt warriors. In reality, the opposite was often true. Scandinavians paid close attention to personal appearance, and cleanliness played a much larger role in their culture than modern depictions suggest. Written sources, especially Anglo-Saxon ones, contain surprised remarks about how often the Northmen bathed, combed their hair, and cut their nails. This caused both respect and suspicion in the authors. The custom of washing daily was almost universal, as was regular cutting of hair, beards, and nails. Mentions of this are found not only in chronicles but are also confirmed by archaeological finds. Graves contain combs made of horn and bone, small scissors, ear spoons, tweezers, and other personal grooming items. Bathing was an integral part of life. The Icelandic word for Saturday literally means bathing day, lagerdagur. Hot stones, wooden buildings with a hearth, steam, and cold water are all described in the sagas as part of daily life. The neatness of the Vikings was also evident in their appearance. Men styled their hair, braided their beards, and emphasized the symmetry of their features. Cleanliness and tidiness also extended to the living environment. Homes were regularly cleaned, swept, and the straw on the floor renewed. Hygiene was seen not as a luxury but as part of a normal, dignified life. After understanding how the Vikings lived and what constituted the basis of their daily life, it is important to understand how they perceived the surrounding world. Everything that happened, birth, weather, death, victory, or failure, was seen not as an accident but as part of the overall cosmic order. Belief was not an abstract idea but the foundation for understanding life and one's place in it. The Nine Worlds and the Gods. Scandinavians imagined the universe as the enormous tree Yggdrasil. Its branches and roots connected 9 worlds, including the world of humans, Midgard, the halls of the gods, Asgard, the abode of the dead, the lands of the giants, and the realms of cold and fire. Everything existed in parallel and was interconnected. If the balance was disturbed in one of these worlds, the consequences were felt in the others. This was not an allegory but the foundation of their worldview. The gods were part of this structure. Odin was associated with wisdom, memory, and secret knowledge. Thor was perceived as the protector of order, respected for his strength but primarily for his ability to keep the world in balance. Frey embodied abundance, prosperity, and harmony. Approaching the gods occurred not through prayer, but through actions. People offered sacrifices, spoke ritual words, and performed necessary rites. There was no separate caste of priests, but there were those who knew how to act correctly at the right moment. The vulva, women with the ability to see the hidden, played a special role. They were called upon at turning points when an important decision had to be made. During a ritual, the vulva would enter a special state and appeal to the forces that could show the way. She was not perceived as a witch, she was a figure of deep respect whose counsel was not disputed. Fate and the afterlife. Central to the Scandinavian worldview was fate, or lag. It was woven by beings called the Norns at the roots of Yggdrasil. No one could change it, even the gods were subject to it. A person did not know when their path would end, but understood that it already existed. The only question was how to walk it. In this context, death was not perceived as an end, it was a transition. Those who died with weapons in hand could be received into Odin's hall, Valhalla. There, warriors continued to exist, fighting, feasting, and preparing for the final battle, Ragnarok. To reach Valhalla meant living a life correctly. To die with honor was more important than to live to a ripe old age. Sources mention cases where elderly men, sensing the approach of death, chose to leave the world voluntarily, going out to sea or asking for help to depart. To die in bed without having done anything significant meant to vanish from memory. This was not superstition, but because the memory of the lineage and reputation meant more than life itself. Farewell rites for the dead were precise and meaningful. Weapons, food, and items that might be useful on the journey were placed in the grave. Sometimes, the deceased was buried in a boat. This was not a symbolic gesture but actual preparation for the continuation of existence. The Vikings strove to leave a name behind. As long as a person was remembered, they continued to exist. Magic did not exist separately from daily life or belief. It was a way to influence what was outside direct control but directly affected life. Scandinavians believed in the power of the word. If spoken precisely and at the right moment, it could influence the outcome of a battle, a person's fate, or the state of the earth. Knowledgeable people could solidify actions through words. The most precise instrument expressing this knowledge was runes. This was a system of written signs where each symbol had its own meaning and effect. The earliest form of runic script, known in Scandinavia, was the Elder Futhark, an alphabet of 24 signs. Each rune had its own name and reflected not just a sound but also an image, for example, wealth, movement, protection, fate, and strength. Later, from the 9th century, the Younger Futhark came into use, a simplified system of 16 signs that became the main alphabet of the Viking Age. Runes were used in situations requiring the will to be fixed, a name to be preserved, protection from misfortune, or an object to be strengthened. They were carved everywhere that made sense. A rune could express the idea of movement, harvest, protection, destiny, or destruction, so carving was done with attention. An error in a sign could change the meaning of the entire action. Runic inscriptions on memorial stones were especially common. They were erected in honor of the deceased to preserve the name and link the lineage with the deeds. Such stones often mention merits, kinship ties, and sometimes even unfulfilled oaths or promises of revenge. Runes also appeared on personal items. Amulets were inscribed with appeals to forces, calls for steadfastness, or brief formulas reflecting the owner's intention. In this society, magic was not opposed to strength. A sword with a runic inscription was considered an extension of the person. An amulet was not just an ornament but an expression of connection to a specific power. Everything accompanied by a sign acquired a different quality. This attitude towards magic was based on respect for knowledge. Influence did not depend on loud words, but on a precise understanding of how the world was structured. The end of an era, from raids to crowns. By the early 11th century, the Scandinavian world was at a turning point. Vikings could still assemble a fleet and land on the shores of Britain or France, but the goals of these campaigns were changing. There were fewer places that could be easily plundered, and the opportunity to seize power attracted more attention. The final wave of expansion occurred not in the form of raids, but through a struggle for crowns. Cnut the Great and the North Sea Empire. In 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard launched a major military campaign against England. England was weakened by internal conflicts and the unsuccessful rule of Athelred, who went down in history as the Unready. Sweyn was supported by some Anglo-Saxon nobles. By the end of the year, he controlled most of the country, including London. But Sweyn soon died in 1014, and power passed to his son, Cnut. The young ruler faced resistance, and the English briefly restored the throne. Cnut retreated but soon returned with an army and systematically took all the key positions over 2 years. In 1016, after the death of King Edmund Ironside, Cnut was recognized as the ruler of all England. From this moment, a unique period began. Cnut ruled simultaneously over Denmark, England, Norway, and partially Sweden. His power rested not only on conquest but also on administrative decisions. He created a solid system of taxes, laws, church organization, and royal administration. Cnut was baptized and actively supported ties with Rome. His state was not a temporary alliance, it functioned as a structure in which the north and west of Europe were united under one center. However, this unification rested on Cnut's own figure. After his death in 1035, the empire began to disintegrate. His sons lacked the same authority. The experience of Cnut, however, showed how far the Scandinavians had advanced. In one generation, they went from military chieftains to full-fledged rulers. The transformation became part of the conclusion of the Viking Age. Free sailors became soldiers in the king's army, jarls became feudal lords, and longships became part of an organized fleet. Harald Hardrada and the Norman conquest. The final court of the Viking Age is often associated with Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. He began his career not in the north but in the south, serving in the Varangian Guard in Byzantium. There, he gained a wealth, experience, and fame that later allowed him to return to Scandinavia as a pretender to the throne of Norway. Harald began his last campaign in 1066. His goal was England, where a struggle for the throne had erupted after the death of Edward the Confessor. Harald claimed the throne based on old agreements. He assembled a fleet and army, landed in the north of England, and won the Battle of Fulford. However, just a few days later, the symbolic Battle of Stamford Bridge occurred. The English king Harald Godwin's son, quickly marching north, attacked the Norwegians near the bridge. Harald fell in battle, fighting in the front ranks. His death is often called the final blow of the Viking Age. The story did not end there. A few weeks later, another pretender invaded England, Duke William of Normandy. He was himself a descendant of the Vikings. His ancestor, Rollo, had founded Normandy a century and a half earlier. In the Battle of Hastings in the same year, 1066, William's army defeated the English. William became the new king of England. This event not only changed the course of English history but also completed the cycle that began with the first Viking raids on British shores. The descendants of the Sea Raiders entered London not with fire, but with heraldry and banners. The Norman conquest was a transition from the Viking Age to the era of medieval kingdoms. The end of the Viking Age was not linked to a single battle. It occurred when the world itself changed. The space in which free war bands had once operated became occupied by laws, fortresses, and kings with permanent armies. For 3 centuries, the Vikings exploited the vulnerability of a fragmented world. But starting in the 10th century, everything changed. Kingdoms strengthened in Europe, built on different principles. Armies became permanent, garrisons regular, and taxes were collected on schedule. Cities were surrounded by stone walls. A clear vertical of power emerged that no longer allowed external forces to operate freely. A similar process occurred in Scandinavia itself. The power of the Jarls gradually ceded to the kings, who no longer just led a military campaign but governed lands through governors, laws, and charters. Structure replaced personal will. Everything that had previously rested on mutual oaths was now subject to a framework. In these conditions, the figure of the free warrior lost its meaning. In parallel, another change took place in Scandinavian life, the religious one. Christianity arrived as a system. It brought a new worldview where the main question was salvation. Instead of a destiny woven by the Norns, the individual received a path determined by the will of God. The goal became not to leave a name in the memory of descendants, but to earn eternal life. The Church provided a new means of communication through literacy, schools, and preaching. Kings became rulers by the grace of God. This order left no room for the independent initiative that had once made a Viking a Viking. But disappearance did not mean destruction. The Scandinavians remained. They became part of the new world. The sailor with an axe became a knight. The silver trader became a merchant at a monastery. The heir of a jarl became a vassal sworn to a king. The Viking Age ended because the very world in which they could exist vanished. The Viking legacy. The history of the Vikings has remained. It continues to echo in place names, especially in eastern and northern England, in human memory, and in the materials unearthed by archaeologists. In Britain, the names of many villages and towns originate from Old Norse. In Normandy, the memory of the Vikings is rooted in aristocratic lineages, architecture, and political history. In Eastern Europe, the Scandinavian presence is felt in archaeological finds and in the names of rulers. Here, Vikings participated in trade, forged alliances, and played a part in the formation of early states. Modern science adds another layer. Genetic studies show that descendants of those who once traveled the Viking routes still live in several regions of Europe. Archaeologists continue to find artifacts related to the Viking Age, weapons, jewelry, ship parts, allowing us to glimpse their everyday life, not just its military side. We have traced a path 3 centuries long, from the first coastal raids to the creation of kingdoms, from a pagan worldview to Christian civilization, from the longship, Drakkar, to the stone castle. The history of the Vikings is not an episode. It is an entire epic that changed the map of Europe, influenced its culture, and continues to be a part of the present.